Hi, I want to talk to you today about the theory of psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis is Sigmund Freud's theory of how the mind works. Psychoanalysis is called the father or the mother of all theories. Almost all the theorists were trained in psychoanalysis. So let's break down psychoanalysis for a minute. Psycho, meaning the soul or the mind. Analysis means to take something apart and to investigate each part. So psychoanalysis takes the mind and investigates it in each of its parts, or it takes the personality and it investigates the personality in each of its parts. The purpose of psychoanalysis is simply this: for the unconscious to become conscious. Now, what does unconscious mean? Unconscious means that we are not aware of it. We're not aware of our thoughts. We're not aware of our desires, not aware of our feelings, not aware of our fantasies. That's simply what unconscious means. Conscious means that we are aware of our thoughts. We're aware of our feelings. We are totally aware of what's going on. So the purpose of psychoanalysis, again, is to make the unconscious conscious. And with psychoanalysis, we want to break down the parts of the psyche. We want to break down the parts of the personality. And what Freud did, he broke the parts of the psyche down into three areas. These three areas are the id, the ego, and the superego. Now let's first talk about the id. The id is simply concerned about our needs, our basic instincts, our desires of hunger, thirst, survival, and sex. That's all that the id cares about. The id operates on the pleasure principle, what is going to bring us the most pleasure. So when children are born, they're born with id. They just want to eat and they just want to sleep. They don't care about anybody else. They just want their desires met. And that's pretty much what the id is about. Now, the ego is a little bit more rational. I've heard some writers call the ego is like a person riding a horse, and the ego is trying to steer that id in the right direction according to reality. It just can't let the id run free. So the ego tries to control the id, and it is based on what we call the reality principle. And then you have the superego. The superego develops in toddlerhood. And with the superego, what the superego does is we're told by our parents, we're told by society, we're told what to do. It gives us our morals and our rules. So you have these three structures of the personality: the id, the ego, and the superego. And you know what? They are bound to clash. And so when they clash, we get these different kinds of anxiety, or we get these different kinds of fears. One fear that we get is neurotic anxiety. Neurotic anxiety is when we think that the desires of the id are going to take over. Another part of the id, I forgot to talk about it earlier, was the eros principle. The eros principle is where we're operating on life, like hunger, thirst, sex. We're operating on a life principle, trying to get life out of things. And Freud also believed in another principle, which is the death principle. Of course, the Thanatos principle. He used a whole lot of Greek back then, which is the death principle when we operate out of aggression. So neurotic anxiety with the id is the id begins to intrude on the ego. The ego is trying to make sure everything is rational and trying to fulfill our desires in a realistic way. And what the ego tries to do is it tries to control everything. But when the id begins to intrude upon the ego, then it causes that neurotic anxiety, what Freud would call neurotic anxiety. The other kind of anxiety we have, and guess what it would be called, would be reality anxiety or real anxiety. Like when I was riding in the car with my parents one day in downtown DC, and Policemen were making a bust and they pulled out a gun. And the reality was that we were scared. We were in fear. And so it is whatever is real out there. Fear of getting mugged, fear of a wild animal, whatever a real anxiety is for a person. So that's another kind of anxiety. And the final kind of anxiety we have is associated, of course, with the superego, which is moral anxiety. And moral anxiety is concerned about disobeying rules, regulations, or morals where we feel like we are doing the wrong thing. And so those are the three kinds of anxieties when the id, ego, and superego begin to clash. So just to review a few matters about psychoanalysis. There are three parts to the personality: the id, the ego, and the superego. As these three begin to clash, then you have this anxiety that happens. You have the neurotic anxiety, the moral anxiety, and the real anxiety, as well as these three begin to clash and intrude upon the ego, who is really trying to control everything. So having an understanding of the structures of personality and the anxieties, that helps us to understand what happens next, because we're trying to protect the ego. And that comes from, the protection comes from defense mechanisms.